Hi, thank you so much for listening to Joyscape Therapy podcast. In order to earn a CE, listen here for the code words, then visit our website at www.joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS. You will enter the code words and your BACB info at checkout, then receive your certificate in 5 to 7 business days.
Okay. So welcome to the 8th episode of the Joyscape Therapy podcast. Today, we're going to be talking to Julie Mae Wallingford and kind of just getting her perspective and kind of a through the lens in honor of Autism Awareness Month. This is a Journal Club Chronicles, so this is worth 1 CE. We'll be reviewing the CDC article put out by Maynor, Warren, Williams, et al., titled The Prevalence and Characteristics of Autism Spectrum Disorder Among Children Aged 8 Years, Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. Well, without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker, Julie Mae.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks so much for coming on today. I'm excited.
Yeah, of course. So I am Julie Mae. I'm with Joyscape, and we are here discussing ASD. I have a diagnosis, so a lot of this is just coming through my lens.
Great. So tell us, because you're not just a BCBA, right?
Right.
You have an awesome resume.
So I have been kind of in and around the field since 2011. My undergrad is actually in speech language pathology from University of Kentucky. And I am an SLPA, and I went to grad school at University of Cincinnati in ABA, and now I'm getting my doctorate through the Chicago School of Professional Psychology.
Yes. Oh, I actually forgot about that fun fact, but yeah, you are in your Ph.D. program. I can't imagine, what that's like working full time and.
Right. And I also try to be a human outside of all of that. So, outside of work, I'm really into fitness and bodybuilding and modeling and photography and makeup and really just being creative and romanticizing my life. And I take a lot of pride in knowledge though. So school has always been kind of fun for me. I get to deep dive in my personal interests. So
I love that. Nice. Awesome. And so what made you so you were SLP first?
SLPA, which is just, you can do that with your undergrad, but working in clinical rotations, I really enjoy being an SLPA and bridge the gap into me working at a verbal behavior clinic that was mentored by Dr. Carbone. So I learned a lot about verbal behavior and provided insight on echoic assessments. And although speech is, multifaceted, I love the emphasis on language and behavior analysis rather than solely like articulation or phonology. And I felt like they really worked in harmony if you have a fluid understanding of each other. So I mostly really loved the kids, and
not surprising.
Yeah. I fell in love, and here I am.
Great. Awesome. So yeah, just kind of getting into, I know we kind of went a little bit back and forth, but, I love that you had mentioned in our exchanges, like having this article would be a really nice, kind of a general hit on like the topic we wanted to get. And, there's lots of different kind of branches we can take this conversation. So just overall, like what were your general thoughts about the article, about the findings?
Right. My first thought was like, wow, thank God it's finally here, an update. So that was the most striking for me. And it also just kind of goes to show that there really are no boundaries with autism. It exists in every facet, every culture, ethnicity, race, gender identity. And like we were discussing earlier, the big thing in our field is always to look at the research, and like this research is there and available finally. But before that, there were so many voices saying, hey, look at me, hear me. And, who is that research benefiting if it's only coming from one group of people? We can't have one privileged group persisting through those generations. And, not to mention it, neurodivergent people in general seem to go against the grain and may not pursue that research. So I'm glad that we're updating it.
Yes. Yeah. And you know what? I had to like read a couple times just to kind of understand, but like it makes sense. It takes a while for, results, findings, publishing, right, to come out. But this is actually taken from a 2020 data. So it's really just barely coming out. But even still, it's the most updated information, like collectively and as a mass, that we have to kind of go off. So that's something interesting too, is that this is really 2020 data. So it's still like 3 years old if we're really, being realistic about it.
Right. Yeah. And there's so much information and there's so much misinformation as well. But with the prevalence of social media, we can at least try and get some accurate information out there. And I think that brings a lot to the forefront for people. I also thinking about, on the converse, with so many people that may need services, we're in a shortage of who can provide those services, and they're relatively novice. Most BCBAs have less than 5 years experience and have likely been trained in graduate programs that focus on like conceptual and technical skills. And there's so much that goes into this field. So I think that it's really powerful to have people in the field that have this lens, having the interpersonal skills and the experience and living the life, I think can be really powerful for building that relationship with families.
Mm-hmm. So well said. Yeah. And I think what comes to me, even as you were saying all of that, is, where do we start? And you have a different lens, but I'm thinking like, even from my standpoint as a BCBA, knowing that I also have my limitations. And then what I heard from you earlier too, where I was like, listening, reading, keeping up to date with those things. But even for someone in our audience, like what advice might you give in terms of like where to start and knowing like our limitations, our capacity, like how do we help, like bridge the gap as best as possible?
Right. I think as practitioners, we can strive to respond efficiently and compassionately to the distress of autistic people. And it's okay to not know what to do. It's okay to take a step back and say, let me consult, or give me some time. Let me think on this. For me personally, and this is just kind of an accommodation I give myself, I write myself scripts for almost everything, just as a guidebook. Okay. And I do that when I'm working with families. I do that when I'm, having this conversation, when I'm having conversations with friends. If something's going to be tough, where I'm like, I'm going to encounter situations I don't know. So I might go ahead and role play the scenario. And that could be a helpful tool for coming across really difficult clinical situations as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I love that. Like you're talking about just like being compassionate and trauma informed, and really like, listening at the forefront and keeping, those perspectives in mind. Like oftentimes I notice myself too, I've worked with adults, and oftentimes I'm calling them kids, and I'm really like focusing on like, no, that they're adults, with autism, with other developmental disabilities, and really helping them, or helping even when I'm talking about them, right? Including them in that conversation, opening it up. So yeah, it does take a lot of like self-awareness and movement, being more mindful.
For sure. Especially when this is the most prevalent population of work is in pediatrics. So it kind of pigeonholes us into learning more about pediatrics, which is great. However, there's a lot of populations where we are useful. I think we know that it just comes down to the research and the funding and the resources to really bridge that gap.
Yes. No, I love that you mentioned funding, and we'll get into that a little bit too, because that does relate to another article that I just referenced, was an opinion-based article titled "There is no epidemic of autism; it's an epidemic of need," and that is written by John Elder Robison and Dina Gassner. And so just kind of melding these two articles, I thought it was a really helpful kind of balance to really get perspective and understand like you mentioned, like finally, right? Like finally voices are being heard, it's being acknowledged, and understanding like this might not necessarily be something that's evolving or new, but rather information that's been there and we just haven't recognized it. And the importance of like getting people access to services, even when we talk about limitations, and the CDC article mentions that as well, as like when they're kind of talking about race and gender, the criteria to the data of the population they analyzed, right? Also might not be fully representative because of access to services, or, other maybe historically marginalized groups that don't have access. So therefore they're not being counted. Right. And so I thought that was, just a whole nother layer to really kind of pin in there and get that understanding.
For sure. And now whenever I'm reading articles, my first thought when I'm analyzing these now is, what are the ethical considerations and how could the author improve on that? And also, what are the social, cultural, and diversity considerations and how could the author improve on that? Moving from rural Kentucky to the Bay Area of California was a huge step and a wake-up call of like, wow, this was not taught to me in grad school, like dealing with cultural competency. It's sort of like I'm on my own. And so I've really tried to embed that in almost everything that I do because it's been necessary. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the biggest components of compassionate care. And I know that it's become a bigger conversation, but how do we get there is the question, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, yeah, tell us a little bit about, what it was like growing up. What age did you get diagnosed?
Okay. So I think of two ages that were really defining for me in this realm when I get this question. The time when it became apparent that something was, and I'm putting this in quotation, something was wrong with me, and the time that I had a formalized diagnosis that I accepted. I had been in some therapies and speech therapy and behavioral therapy and engaging in compulsive behaviors that I didn't understand and I couldn't stop, but I didn't have the voice really to explain what I was doing. I didn't know, and no one was giving me that information either. So when I was first given a quotient type assessment at age 11, I felt like an outsider. And that's because of the lack of training and resources in rural Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in couldn't even call it a town. I didn't have an address until I was 11. But because of that lack of training and resources, it's nothing like it is in Bay Area in California. So I experienced a lot of medical gaslighting, I'm realizing. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I really thought, I'm going to get a second opinion and have someone validate that for me, because I was always second guessing it. And I didn't feel quite ready to understand myself until I got into my 20s. And then now into my 30s, I'm here, and I'm feeling way more comfortable to talk about these things now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from 11, even into 20, you kind of touch on it a little bit, but like, what were some of the supports that you had? I know you mentioned some of the therapies you received, but did it come from school? Or what was the most that resonated with you, or that you did feel like was helping you in a way that, because you mentioned in your 20s, you felt like you needed to kind of be reassessed and kind of get a diagnosis or, get evaluated to the point where you felt like it was a kind of an acceptable, right? Like you felt that maybe that was a better fit. Was there anything from 11 to 20 that kind of did work, or what was that like?
I felt like I was just tossed around from therapy to therapy. And that was because, I grew up with an amazing support system who was really trying, but I just didn't have access to the services, and healthcare is worlds different in really rural areas. And, growing up around poverty, there's just not a lot of advanced healthcare. So my mom would take me all across the state and across state lines to try and get me into like some groups or different types of therapy that were working. And I feel like that was just part of my journey. But it wasn't until I really moved in 2020 to California that I was like, wow, I have all this access. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to go to the doctor. Like, I'm going to go to the dentist. Like, I finally have access to all of these things now. But as far as accommodations, I got a few from school, but it's similar to what a lot of public schools can still just provide, every so often speech therapy through public school, every so often behavioral therapy. And I constantly felt like I was starting over because there's a lot of turnover in those fields as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, even if we can like shoot a piece of helpful advice, autism is a spectrum, right? So I'm sure, if there are parents like listening in and just hearing what it sounds like, you had a great support system to be able to like go, from one place to the other and really evaluate that. And that doesn't necessarily mean financial, right? But even the capacity to really like navigate those things. And we did an episode previously on like interdisciplinary collaboration and interprofessional collaboration. But yeah, like, I guess I wonder if some of our kids that we have now, who maybe don't have a voice, or don't have even the words, right, to express, it's a very mature kind of skill to able to even do that, to express like, hey, this isn't working, or this is what it feels like. So yeah, I guess any advice to parents, or, you shared your perspective, but any kind of added notes to give parents a little bit of hope, or, to kind of guide them. Like you said, every journey is different, but yeah, anything to add to that?
Well, I felt like my mom was such a huge voice for me, and, so advocating for your child or yourself or whoever in your life that might be experiencing this or needing some type of accommodation, advocating for them for one thing, and really just supporting them with the resources in whatever way you can. If that's a little bit of extra help, or just the validation that it's okay to go, or it's okay to reach out. That validation in itself was really huge for me, to feel like supported and heard and understood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Do you have any siblings?
I do. I have an older brother who's 3 years older than me. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I know we actually this is all kind of meshing for me, because I've gone kind of through each episode, and I'm glad we are touching on content that each episode, even though it's a different topic, they kind of intertwine, right? And so it's really interesting to kind of hear. So one of our other colleagues, Samantha S, came on and talked about her experience as a sibling, and really sharing that. So I just asked, because I know you mentioned like in the article we reviewed prior, it talked a lot about like how to continue to like enhance the bond, the closeness between siblings. Had a lot to do with like that family support, a little bit with also like gender and age difference. But yeah, just kind of out of curiosity was wondering if you had siblings, because that in itself too is like getting access to things, and remembering still to be like everyday people, right? Like you're still a family, and you're still trying to get access to what one kid needs. But I think it's awesome when families really do show like how resilient they are and able to get what your child needs. So
yeah, my brother is another part of just that really core support system that I have, and so much so that I'm going to have him be my officiant at my wedding. He means everything to me. And I feel like he always advocated for me and was my voice when I couldn't be, or really helped me through like some of the darker storms.
Oh, I love that. There was a tidbit of, obviously every article has its limitations, right? But kind of as a general statement, they did mention that when the sibling was a male and their other sibling who had a diagnosis was a female, likely that relationship was a little more like challenging to keep into adulthood. They looked at findings from adolescence into adulthood. So that's really awesome to see, you know what I mean? And to hear rather. That's so cool that he's officiating your wedding.
Yeah, he's wonderful. So he's an anomaly.
Nice. Just kind of getting into some of the research. I think there's been a lot of hype, at least I've seen too, on just the new data of like 1 in 36 children are diagnosed with autism. So is this something that was like surprising to you, or, any kind of comments initially that came up when this data came out?
Again, I think my first thought was really just like, finally this is updated, because I was like, there's no way that even with like the shrinking ratio, I was like, there's no way it's even this big, because we were at what, like 1 in 56 or something before, or somewhere around that. So I think this is really helpful too, and like just validating again in that, this is real to me and it's something that I struggle with every day. So just personally, it's another thing that helps me. And, I think that there's a lot of buzzwords in our community too, especially like on social media, which contributes to some good and bad, right? And that's with everything with social media. But I think if we're only looking at the good, it's a lot more acceptance and just understanding, and we can get more accurate information out there the more that this research is updated.
And I know we talked about kind of some of the criteria. We briefly touched on it. So just out of the population that they looked at for this particular article, was that a child had to meet a case definition if their record was documented as one, either an ASD diagnostic statement in an evaluation, a classification of ASD in special education, and third would be an ASD International Classification of Disease, ICD code. Some of the limitations in that too, like we had discussed earlier, was just like if children go undiagnosed, they might not even be included in this. And also like how common is that, right? Like even hearing you talk about your own experience, misdiagnose children, right? So I think it's just another thing to consider. And I love how they pointed out, like there's a need for enhanced infrastructure to provide equitable diagnostic kind of treatment and support for services for all children with ASD. So I don't know if there was anything in particular kind of within that criteria range that resonated with you, Julie Mae.
Right. Yeah. So I think number one, when you mentioned ASD diagnostic statement in an evaluation, is what resonates with me. And when we're thinking about the misdiagnosis, I think everyone is so different on the spectrum. And I see it as more of a spherical, ever expansive like universe, as opposed to like this linear sliding scale of like more or less autistic. And I've find myself, really struggling with comorbidities too, which contributed to a lot of my confusion throughout my childhood. And I'm kind of right in the middle of the Venn diagram between ADHD, ASD, and OCD. So I really struggle with differentiating between what is what, but I've had to stop doing that and figuring out who I am in each of those individual circles, and understanding that it's okay to fall under one thing at one time or be right in the middle, because my like long-term mentor, she's an amazing BCBA. She always says it's non-binary, it's not so black and white.
Oh, I love just, and I'm reading it in articles, but it's just so much more like heartfelt, meaningful, impactful, to hear it from you, and to kind of, we could read all day long, but that also doesn't, negate like having these conversations or hearing these conversations from someone who has the perspective like you do, right? And really listening, and doing our best to understand, even if that competes with maybe our own experience. So yeah, I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the voices are important to listen to what we need, but also to understand that although I'm starting to feel more comfortable and more powerful and more open about the dialogue, it's still just such a challenge and such a struggle at any moment, because of my needs. And, those are like sensory issues and STEMs and social situations. Those things are not going to go away in my life. And so I've really had to advocate for myself and learn how to do that too. Outside of my field, I think is the bigger challenge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you find that that's challenging when you're kind of building boundaries from home life to work life?
For sure. More so like just navigating like what to say and what to do in certain social scenarios and like social circles, I think can be difficult. And sometimes I have to try and turn my like brain off as far as being a behavior analyst and just be a human for a second, because I'm caught in the web of, I have a diagnosis, I am a behavior analyst, and I'm back in school, I'm in my doctorate now. So I'm constantly like just deep diving all this information, and it gets a little existential sometimes if I think too hard about it. So I've got to just let go.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that you mentioned like it's not linear, right? And they mentioned that too in one of the articles, just kind of not us having to fit us. I say us, right? Even there, right? Like trying to check myself, but fitting autistic individuals into a box in so many words. Versus like, letting them be. And even when I'm working with my clients and their families, I often do kind of struggle between, even when we're talking about STEMs or, certain behavioral issues, when like, okay, I'm also strong-willed, and like there has to be room for a little bit of their, personality, their will, because we all have that. So I just loved how you mentioned that, sometimes they're trying to say, is this my, ADHD or OCD or autism, or, you kind of struggle between fitting it here or there. And sometimes you have to like let loose, right? To let be.
Absolutely. And, I can recognize those challenges and work on them at the same time. And I've developed those skills throughout my life, like through my therapy. So on one hand, I'm so thankful. On the other, I'm like, who would I really be without having worked on it for so long? So sometimes I kind of sit and just think on that. But ultimately, I think that I've really come so far, especially because like, I do experience harmful STEMs, and that can be a little bit different. We don't want to suppress any STEMs that are not harmful, but what about when they are? So I'm constantly still working on finding something to replace that, and that's been like a lifelong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what has it like been like relating to your clients? I know we've probably talked about it a lot on the podcast, but Joyscape is the 2-tier model. So, it must be really awesome for your clients, to have kind of the lens that you do, that most of us don't as BCBAs. I think that's safe to say. But yeah, like what is it like working with your kids and like your relatability or maybe challenges you might face in that same realm?
Yeah, I think I've seen both. I'm way more open about it than I ever used to be. And I don't see myself ever wanting to be like the poster child, but I'm not completely in the shadows anymore. And so I think it's really powerful when I share my diagnosis with the client, not for comparison's sake. I think that's been the challenge there is, I'm in my 30s and I'm a woman and I'm being compared to their child sometimes, but just to give them a glimpse of like, hey, life isn't over after a diagnosis. It's just beginning, because there's a lot of like guilt and grief and shame that's been studied as well for these families.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And kind of even just going off of that, like, have you talked to your mom? Like, you have such great like presentation, and I know you've talked already just about, it does take a little more work for you in some social situations, and you do your scripts and things like that. But, what has your relationship with your mother been like or mother, or even other, like your brother you had mentioned a little bit about, but to be able to express like what has been helpful, or, how your relationship might have evolved as you seem like you've been able to come more into your own. What has that kind of evolution been like?
Yeah, I think in the moment as an adolescent, it's harder to see outside of yourself just in general. Looking back and being able to be more reflective and be more self-aware and express myself more. I just realized I have such a major support system and tons of people in my corner, and I can't fully be myself or reveal my needs unless I'm with those like most intimate people. And, when I look at my mom or I look at my brother, like they are those people for me. Otherwise in larger circles, I'm mostly imitating or letting someone else fill the void when I'm nervous or when I don't know what to do. And I love being alone, some of those just like key markers. But when I look at those people I'm closest with, like they are just treasures to me, and they've really helped me.
Oh, that's awesome. I know you kind of touch on it a little bit too already, but like, what is your social circle like? And, even if you look a little bit further into adolescence, what was it like growing up and making friends, or were there any challenges there, or maybe friends that didn't understand? Tell us a little about that.
Yeah. Oh gosh, growing up, that's hard. I think just for everybody. I did have a hard time socially, like just having like more intimate one-on-one friends. I definitely did develop some really close best friends that I have, to this day. Making new friends is always still kind of hard, but again, I've got a huge circle, and I realized that not everybody has to get me. And in adolescence, that was a harder lesson to learn, but looking back, I'm glad, I have who I have. I did experience things, like bullying and all of that, but I feel just so much bigger than that. At the end of the day, though, like I still like I love and I appreciate that social circle and those friends that I have, but I love being me, and I love like finding time to hang out with me. And I think that helps me be able to be social. And I call it my hidey hole. Like sometimes I have to go in my hidey hole mode and like be in the dark and be quiet. And for a long time, like eating alone or traveling alone, it really helps me come down from the overload and trying to fit into the mold. Like that can just be really emotionally exhausting sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, even just in adulthood, I feel like navigating like how to be alone and be comfortable being alone, and really also making space for that, and
right.
that takes effort in itself. And being able to enjoy things on your own, and make time, especially when we talk about like that work-life balance challenge.
For sure. Yeah. And like developing relationships now, at work, like I have so many interests in common with everyone that I feel like I've been able to kind of just talk shop, which I actually like doing. And so this is like really fun for me.
Great. I'm glad you're Yeah, open. And I also love how you mentioned earlier, like not necessarily being the poster child, right? But also not being in the shadows. It's like just because you're sharing your experience doesn't mean that is the experience, right? That's your experience. And it's so awesome to hear. And I think it does take a lot of courage. So it's so cool to also hear, how you've come into your own, but also the confidence you walk into, and take on some situations, even like this. I'm glad that it's fun, but you mentioned before, there's some social situations that are a little more nerve-wracking, and you still navigate those. So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, everything honestly comes down to me being able to prime myself and prepare myself and having those accommodations. When I don't have them, I do have challenges. But I still kind of have some things in my back pocket that I feel like I'm able to pull out, and I'm not, at the end of the day, like I'm going to survive it. I'm going to get through it regardless.
Mm-hmm. So just getting into some of the research too, and they mentioned girls, right? The ratio from boys to girls getting diagnosed for girls is much lower. We can talk about tons of reasons of why that might be, but let's, from your perspective, what is your take on that? Because it's still low.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's a major difference, that could present itself just based on social and gender expectations, for one thing. I feel like there's a lot of social rules that I have a hard time understanding. We'll boil it down to even things like girl code. I'm like, what is that? So I think that a lot of it comes down to just like social expectations. But again, like who's in the field, who wrote the research, who is it benefiting? If the majority of white males are writing the research, then perhaps we're only looking at that population. And so that's why I look at research now, and I'm immediately, my thought is, okay, what are the ethical considerations here? What are the social, cultural, and diversity considerations? And I try to just think about, if I were to write an extension of this article, what would I write?
Oh, yes. Wow. Well, we can't wait.
Well, I'm constantly reading, so I have a lot of writing to do.
Yes. No, you're so right. And I'm glad you kind of bring in, gender and race. And that's something that the article also touched on. And even if we're looking at research, I think they mentioned from 2018 to 2020, is that it's evolved into, the majority being that white children had more prevalence to be diagnosed. And then we start to see that kind of level out, and then it change, right? So then again, some of that is also access, misdiagnosis, when we talk about lower income households, and even the criteria, like special education or special education diagnosis, or just an evaluation in general. And when you talk about your mom being able to advocate for you, what about those kids that maybe don't have one parent, two parents, whatever it might be? So there's a lot of different kind of factors, right, that can play into that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a web of privilege, and so there's a lot of considerations there. And again, it's not so black and white. Like somebody could be, really privileged in one area, but something else is really holding them back from accessing something. So, I agree. Access is everything when it comes to healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And healthcare. Yeah. Healthcare can get us into a whole, another realm. And I know we mentioned funding earlier, because when we talk about equitable, kind of adjustments to treatments and services, funding is like, as BCBA is coming from a clinical perspective, like that's how we get funded. That's how we're able to go out and, provide the services. So when we're talking about healthcare, and access, that has and equitability, right? For me, I'm thinking it's hard for me to just read the information and not kind of think of like, oh, how could we tweak that? How could we change it? How could we make it more accessible? So that I always kind of get caught in that like web of my own thinking of, we could talk about it all day, but what does it look like in practice to change and make a positive impact?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that it's a helpful tool to just look at, not necessarily looking at research or data as if something's already wrong with it, but just to constantly question, as scientists, like we should be questioning things or questioning, is this really accurate, because it's not encompassing the full population, or it's not really like giving us a very diverse look into this answer. And a lot of that funding is going to be based on the research, like they're not going to fund something that doesn't work or that won't be beneficial. So we have to really fight tooth and nail in general for things that are beneficial. So like getting more access and getting more funding is even harder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to kind of take a look into female labor. Sorry, I'm just looking at some of my notes. We kind of talked about like the co-occurring conditions and how that might affect like the diagnostic process. And even in the second article, kind of the opinion-based one, they did also talk about placement of schools. And they had posed kind of a question of, it's always a balancing act, right? I also think about that for some of my clients that are newly diagnosed, and when they're going through the IEP process. I've worked in schools before, in autism classrooms, and sometimes I always get nervous of now when I'm on the other end of working in home or in the community and center, like in placements in schools, I get concerned with like, are they getting challenged enough? Sometimes those behaviors or even some of the medical diagnosis, the medications, right, can affect and then present in a certain way, right? So I don't know if you had any thoughts. I could talk on for days of just my insights, but yeah, what are some of your thoughts on that and kind of either missing the mark or maybe over-diagnosing, right? That's another thing we haven't quite talked about yet, but what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. And it also boils down to who's the provider in the area and what's their experience. If you're in a town like I was that has one doctor, one school, there's only one option. So they did make it black and white. It's either you're in this classroom or this classroom. And I've always really excelled as far as academics. But I definitely could have used, some more resources socially or behaviorally. And I had to grow up and find those myself, honestly. So I think that schools are a bigger, more systemic conversation that we could have. And it's overwhelming to even really think about it. And the unfortunate part about placement too is that there's stigma and exclusion that comes with underfunded schools. And then, when an intellectual disability diagnosis might be a play, when maybe it's not even accurate, it could really affect the longevity of their care. It could affect their trust in the systems. So it's a big conversation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you hit exactly on that. It's right, what that might present. And then, you mentioned the intellectual disabilities, maybe presenting itself in one way, but that not actually being the case, right? And I love how you also mentioned trust. I think that's right, trust in the system, trust in, those evaluating, right? I think you mentioned, if I understood correctly, right, at 11 versus 20, those were two different things happening for you, and you had to outreach that yourself. which some of our kids might not have that ability to do. So, it's really such, like, I'm trying to find the word, right? Like, it's so persistent of you, right? And resilient of you to be able to say, no, I'm not okay with this. Like, there's something else. And like you talked about, I think it was medical bias, right? So go ahead.
A lot of gaslighting as well. Yeah. Medical gaslighting. I wasn't funded either whenever I had to reach out, which is just crazy, that the evaluations we want wouldn't be funded. And if I weren't in a place where I could do that at that time, then, I would still be struggling with finding and understanding myself and really like validating that experience. Because when I was 11 and receiving all these assessments and getting different diagnoses, I didn't know which way to turn because it felt very much like you have one option or not. And, as I've grown as an individual and in the field, then it's just not the case. There are options, but it does come down to being able to afford and access them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about, because you mentioned like living in a small town, that definitely plays a huge factor. So how about when you went to college, did you move out of your home or was it like a commute? How was that kind of big change in environment if you did move out?
Yeah, I think I was ready just because of some of my social experiences in a small town. I felt like ready to experience something different, but it definitely like uprooted a lot of what I was used to. And I had to be very flexible to that. And it took a while to do so. I went to college in a town that was about an hour and a half away. So I moved out the day after I graduated high school. And I'm ready. Like, I'm going to go try and find a job. And it was all just really hard.
Yeah.
But I made it through.
Nice. Were you able to find like a college job? Like, I know I worked at a retail when I went to college, but like, were you able to find something that suited your interest? Or, again, it's so hard. I would have never known if you didn't share. So like, just to hear about some of like how you navigated those skills that we might seem, that we might take for granted to be able to, get a job or exercise that flexibility. Like, what was it like navigating some of like the college life?
Yeah, that was really difficult. And thankfully I did have access to different therapies through my college. Okay. I can't say that, I found the perfect fit, but I was trying and I was working a couple different jobs until I was really interested in pursuing speech because I had been in speech for a while. And my mom also experiences very severe to profound deafness. And so I was coming at it from a couple of different angles of like, I think that this is something I want to pursue. And then when I was doing like my clinical rotations and work in that clinic, then I really enjoyed just understanding myself more. And so that became a fun job for me.
Yes, great. And what was it like working with Dr. Carbone?
Wow.
What a privilege. That's so cool. I'm sure.
No, I never knew.
Sure the audience is probably like, make sure you ask her about that.
Yeah, I never knew like what a big deal he was at first. And even like my mentor that I've talked about, she has been a BCBA since like, I don't know, 80s or 90s. And so she's been in the field and kind of watched it grow. And now she's working in like starting like a tech company that will help behavior analysts. So together, they really taught me and everyone that I kind of grew up in the field with, like at my clinic. They really taught us a lot. I was able to receive like training personally from Dr. Carbone. And so he's just of a brilliant mind, and I felt really lucky to do that.
Yeah. Awesome. And so, yeah, just kind of wrapping up a little bit here with the last few minutes. Was there anything that you felt? I do have a few more questions, like kind of just your thoughts on inclusivity and, neurodivergence. And, we're hearing that word a lot more in conversations. And, I even kind of confessed to you, right, of like really understanding it and, understanding like how to use it, right? As a clinician, I think that, I could read all day, but yeah, any kind of thoughts on inclusivity and neurodivergence and, any thoughts on that?
Definitely. I saw somewhere the other day because, that word pops up all the time on like some of the Instagram accounts I follow and it's an easy to understand word. So I understand why it's kind of like buzzing. But just in thinking about it in reality, that it should be an experience, not a classroom. But again, that's going to take some systemic change from every level to change that. Like in the meantime, I think every bit of accurate information given to the public can be helpful to create that experience. Mm-hmm. And as for neurodivergence, again, seeing a lot of misinformation that I kind of freeze or I don't know how to respond like in conversations, because I feel like there are times too when it's thrown around loosely or jokingly, and that's dangerous. It robs people of their experience and it robs people of inclusivity. So the fact that like those two words are thrown around so loosely, I think are actually kind of working against each other at some times. And so there could maybe be just more emphasis in the field in general to like be mindful of the way we use some of those buzzwords and disseminate the information appropriately and accurately.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. Beautifully said. I mean, yeah, I think that is something I just like, keeping my ears open and asking questions, even if they sometimes feel uncomfortable or like dumb questions. And just trying to learn as much, but I love that you hit that on the head. I feel like, because even in social media, sometimes you hear, or you see these really cool posts, but some of that misinformation that might be out there, is really alarming. So thank you for your honesty.
Yeah, of course. And I think the biggest takeaway too is just like listening and understanding and empathizing with the challenges that are still there, and asking, what can I do? How can I help? How can I be an accommodation to you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I love how you mentioned earlier about like, even when you're reading research, or even watching things, right? Like looking at it from a lens of who, what is the, bias, the limitations, who's writing it. Because that does change things. You start to question in a very healthy way, right? We should be having that philosophical doubt, and navigating that. And I think that really is also a skill that a lot of BCBAs should already have, right? We see data, we analyze, but how to navigate that, there might be 10 million different ways to navigate one situation. So I do hope that if we take anything, it is that, really listening and doing our best to understand, but also questioning in a really healthy way of like, what is this experience for the client, or the family, and really trying to understand that and help them navigate as a unit.
For sure. And I can say that even from conducting research myself, that research is hard and there's a lot of limitations to what you can do. And there's constant hurdles of approval. And there's all kinds of limitations when you're doing it yourself. So I can only imagine with all of the research we use and learn and preach that same group of people that were doing the research experienced something that maybe wasn't even mentioned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that is awesome. And so, just kind of wrapping up, if you had any additional, the code word for today, do you have a code word that you'd like to put out there? Because I have one, but I don't know, maybe yours would be cooler.
Oh, let's hear yours first.
My code word would be experience.
Experience.
I love the way you put, like, it's not an explanation or, something to that extent, but it's an experience.
I like that a lot.
Okay. Yeah. So code word for today's CE will be experience. But sorry to cut you off. Did you have any kind of last thoughts?
Last thoughts, I think, neurodivergence to me is just, it's recognition for the way that I'm wired, even if it's maybe not so visible, that it doesn't have a face or a look or doesn't sound or act in one specific way. So if we can just recognize and accept that, then I think we'll get a lot further.
Awesome. I'm going to leave it at that because that is just so well put. Julie Mae, it was so nice to have you on here. And thank you for your honesty, your courage, your resilience, and sharing your experience. So yeah, that's a wrap on our episode 8. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you so much.